The first cut of the axe into the pine log was a sound swallowed by the vast white silence. Elias brought the tool down again, the sharp steel biting deep, sending a spray of fragrant chips onto the crusted snow. Each swing was deliberate, a measured rhythm of effort and breath. Beside him, a large, dark-furred dog with intelligent amber eyes sat patiently, his tail a still question mark against the snow. Boro did not whine or fidget. He watched, his gaze fixed on the young man's labor, as if he were a foreman inspecting the work. The air was cold enough to make a man's lungs ache, a dry, sharp cold that promised more snow was on its way. It was late autumn, and the valley was already surrendering to winter's siege. Elias was 18 years old, though the quiet set of his jaw and the focused gravity in his eyes made him seem older. He had his father's height and his mother's dark hair, but the stubborn patience was all his own. It had been 6 months since the fever took them both, leaving him with the small, sturdy cabin, 40 acres of timbered land, and a silence that felt heavier than any stone. He worked to fill that silence. He worked because it was the only thing that made sense. He finished splitting the log and began shaping the pieces, not for firewood, but for something else entirely. Using a handsaw and a draw knife, he fashioned long, flat planks, 2 feet wide, and shorter cross braces. His hands, though gloved, were already showing the raw, scraped knuckles of relentless work. He was building forms, large wooden rectangles he would place against the outer walls of his cabin. "Going to build yourself a second house out there, boy?" The voice, rough and laced with amusement, carried easily in the still air. Elias looked up. Silas Croft, his nearest neighbor from a half-mile down the valley, stood on the path, leaning on a gnarled walking stick. He was a man whose face was a road map of harsh winters and lean summers, his eyes narrowed in permanent skepticism. Elias straightened his back, feeling the familiar ache. He nodded a greeting but offered no explanation. Silas gestured with his stick toward the strange wooden frames stacked near the cabin. "Putting up siding? A bit late in the year for that. Ground's near frozen solid." "Not siding," Elias said. His voice was quiet, unused. Silas squinted, his gaze traveling from the frames to the cabin walls, then back again. "Well, it's the craziest thing I've ever seen. What are you planning to do, build a fence against your own house?" He let out a short, barking laugh. Boro lifted his head and issued a low, soft growl, a rumble in his chest that was more warning than threat. Elias placed a hand on the dog's head, and the sound ceased. "I have a plan," Elias said. "A plan," Silas repeated, the word dripping with doubt. He shook his head, a gesture of pity. "Your father was a good man, Elias. A bit odd, with all his books and his scribbling, but a good man. He wouldn't want you wasting your strength on foolishness. You've got firewood to chop for the whole winter. That's your plan, the only one that matters." Elias didn't argue. He had already chopped the wood. 10 cords, stacked high and dry against the lee side of the woodshed, more than enough to last until spring. He had spent August and September doing nothing else. He simply turned back to his work, picking up the draw knife. The smooth, shaving sound of the blade against wood was his only reply. Silas watched for another minute, then snorted. "Wait until the first real snow. You'll forget all about this nonsense." He turned and continued down the path, his muttering about the follies of youth fading into the pines. Elias did not watch him go. He was already measuring the next plank. The plan was not his own, not entirely. It was his father's. After the funeral, when the crushing weight of emptiness threatened to pull him under, Elias had found the journals. There were a dozen of them, leather-bound and filled with his father's precise, angular script. They were filled with observations of the natural world, the patterns of frost on a window pane, the way a willow bent in the wind, the insulating properties of a fox's den. And there was a section, 20 pages long, titled The Thermos House, A Theory of Cryo-Insulation. His father, a man the valley had considered an eccentric scholar who had inexplicably chosen a homesteader's life, had developed a radical theory. He wrote of the Inuit, who used compressed snow to build shelters that could be warm enough for shirt sleeves while a blizzard raged outside. But his idea went further. He theorized that a wall made not just of packed snow, but of snow, water, and wood pulp, frozen into a solid, dense mass, would have the thermal resistance of stone and the insulating power of wool. A foot-thick barrier of this material, which he called pykrete in his notes, could, in theory, maintain a stable interior temperature with minimal heating, even in the most extreme cold. Conventional wisdom sees snow as a burden, his father had written, a thing to be shoveled and cursed. But it is a gift. It is a blanket woven by the sky. We fight it when we should be embracing it. The answer to the cold is the cold itself, properly applied. The valley folk, like Silas, built their cabins with thick logs and chinked the gaps with mud and moss. They burned cords of wood all winter, their homes perpetually oscillating between sweltering near the stove and freezing by the windows. They believed the only way to fight the cold was with overwhelming fire. Elias's father had believed in a different way, a quieter way. He had never built it. The theory remained on the page, a dream of a man who had run out of time. Now, it was Elias's inheritance. It was more than a plan. It was a testament. By the end of the week, he had finished the forms. There were 20 of them, each 8 feet long and 2 feet wide, built of sturdy pine. He spent 2 more days mounting them against the cabin's north and west walls, the directions from which the winter winds were most vicious. He left a gap of precisely 12 inches between the outer surface of the log wall and the inner surface of his new wooden forms. The cabin now looked as if it were wearing a strange skeletal corset. Mr. Gable, the owner of the general store in the small settlement of Hemlock's Crossing 5 miles away, drove his wagon past on his way to a timber claim. He pulled his horse to a halt, his round face creased with stern disapproval. "Elias," he called out, his voice accustomed to command. "What in God's name is this?" "I'm preparing for winter, Mr. Gable," Elias said, securing the last brace. "Preparing?" Gable's laugh was louder and more condescending than Silas's had been. "It looks like you're tearing the place down. This is your father's daydreaming nonsense, isn't it? I remember him talking about houses made of ice, a fool's idea. That wood you've wasted there could have been split for kindling or sold." Elias met the man's gaze. "It's not wasted." "We'll see about that when the January winds are blowing through this monstrosity you've built," Gable said, shaking his head. "I told your father, and I'm telling you, stick to what works. Logs and fire. That's how we survive here." He flicked the reins, and the wagon creaked away. Elias watched him go, his jaw tight. He knew what they thought of him. The quiet orphan, touched by the same madness as his father. Let them think it. His proof would not be in words. The first heavy snow arrived a week later. It came silently in the night, a thick, downy blanket that covered everything. When Elias opened his door in the morning, the world was white and muffled. The air was thick with the clean metallic scent of deep cold. Boro plunged into the fresh powder, rolling and kicking his legs in the air with a rare display of puppy-like joy. Elias felt a faint smile touch his lips. The work could now begin in earnest. He had a large water barrel at the corner of the cabin, fed by the roof gutter. It was already half frozen, a thick crust of ice on top. He broke it with a hammer, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed world. He filled 2 buckets. Then he went to the woodshed, where he had a pile of sawdust and wood shavings he'd been saving for months. He filled a 3rd bucket with the pulp. He dragged a large metal trough to the north wall. Into it he shoveled snow, heaps of it, light and crystalline. Then he poured in the water and the sawdust, mixing it with a long-handled spade. The mixture was a heavy, sodden slush, an ugly gray-white gruel. It began to freeze almost instantly. Working quickly, he shoveled the slush into the gap between the cabin wall and the first wooden form. He packed it down hard, tamping it with the end of a thick pole, forcing out the air, creating a dense, heavy layer. The cold was his ally, turning the wet mass solid within minutes. He worked his way up, shovelful by shovelful, until the first 8-foot section was filled to the top. It was brutal, punishing labor. Hauling snow, breaking ice for water, mixing the heavy slurry, hoisting it, packing it. His shoulders burned, his back screamed, and his hands, despite his gloves, grew numb and clumsy. By dusk, he had filled only 3 of the 20 sections. He was slick with sweat that threatened to freeze the moment he stopped moving, and he was exhausted to the bone. He retreated into the cabin, Boro trailing close behind. The small room was frigid. He lit the stove, and its familiar iron ticking soon filled the space. As warmth slowly seeped into the room, he peeled off his wet gloves. His knuckles were bleeding again, the skin split by the cold and the rough work. He washed them in a basin of lukewarm water, hissing as the water stung the raw flesh. Boro came and rested his heavy head on Elias's knee, whining softly. "It's all right, boy," Elias murmured, stroking the dog's thick fur. "It's just the first day." He ate a simple meal of bread and salted pork, then opened his father's journal again, finding the relevant page. "The process must be layered," the script read. "Allow each section to freeze completely solid before adding the next. Patience is the mortar, the cold is the mason." The next day he continued, and the day after. It became his entire world. Dawn would find him breaking the ice on the water barrel. The day would be a repeating cycle of shoveling, mixing, hoisting, and packing. The sun, a pale disk in the winter sky, would travel its low arc as he worked, a silent witness. The filled sections of the forms grew, a creeping wall of frozen slurry encasing the cabin. People from the settlement would sometimes pass on the main path and stop to stare. Their expressions ranged from pity to open mockery. Children pointed. Teenagers called out jokes. "Building a tomb, Elias? Hope you left a door." Elias ignored them all. He kept his head down, his focus narrowed to the task at hand. The weight of the shovel, the consistency of the mix, the solid thud of the tamper. One afternoon, as he was mixing a batch of the slush, a new voice spoke. "What's the sawdust for?" He looked up, surprised. It was a young woman, perhaps his age. She was bundled in a heavy wool coat, a red scarf covering the lower half of her face. Her eyes, a clear and startling blue, were fixed on his work with genuine curiosity, not ridicule. He recognized her as Anya, Mr. Gable's daughter. She had been away, studying in a city down south, and had only recently returned. Elias stopped his mixing. "It's for strength," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Like straw in a brick." She pulled down her scarf. Her face was bright from the cold. "My father says you're packing snow against your house." "It's more than snow," he said, gesturing to the trough. "Water makes it dense. The pulp binds it. It freezes harder than ice." Anya walked closer, her boots crunching in the snow. She touched the surface of a section he'd completed 2 days before. It was not white and fluffy, but a solid grayish mass, hard as rock and slick with a thin veneer of frost. "It feels like stone," she said, her voice holding a note of wonder. "That's the idea." She looked from the wall to his face, her gaze direct. "Why?" It was a simple question, but no one had asked it with sincerity before. They had only ever told him why not. "To stay warm," he said. "My father believed. He wrote that a wall like this would hold the heat in, that you wouldn't need a big fire all the time, that the cold on the outside would keep the inside warm." "By freezing the walls?" She smiled, a small, tentative thing. "It doesn't make sense." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." And yet she didn't laugh. She looked at the wall again, at the sheer scale of the labor it represented. She saw the exhaustion etched on his face, the raw state of his hands. "You must believe it a great deal," she said softly. Elias just nodded, then turned back to his trough. The slurry was starting to stiffen. He had to keep moving. He expected her to leave, but she stayed, watching in silence for nearly an hour as he filled another 2-foot layer of a section. She watched him work with a steady, quiet attention that was the opposite of the valley's scorn. When the light began to fail, she finally spoke. "Your hands," she said, her gaze on his bleeding knuckles as he pulled off a glove to adjust a brace. He quickly put the glove back on. "They'll heal." "You should put some salve on them," she said. "My mother makes a good one with comfrey and tallow." He just grunted in acknowledgement, his focus on setting a pin in the wooden form. "Good luck, Elias," she said, and before he could respond, she had turned and walked away, her red scarf a slash of color against the growing twilight. He worked for 2 more weeks. The task consumed his days and haunted his nights. He dreamed of the weight of snow, the shock of icy water, the rhythmic packing of the pole. The cabin was now fully encased on 2 sides by a monolithic wall of the frozen mixture, a solid 12-inch thick shield. The final step, according to his father's notes, was to add a loose layer. He spent 2 more days piling fresh, dry snow against the outside of the hardened pykrete wall, creating a final, fluffy blanket a foot thick, which would act as the first barrier against the wind. When he was done, the cabin looked less like a house and more like a natural formation, a strange, rectangular snowdrift that had grown up around a log structure. The north and west walls had vanished completely beneath a thick, seamless shell of white. He had left the windows clear, carving deep, angled wells through the snow so that a pale, diffused light could still find its way inside. The day he finished, Silas Croft came by again. He stood for a long time, just looking. The amusement was gone from his face, replaced by a profound, baffled pity. "You've done it, then," Silas said, his voice flat. "You've buried your own house." Elias was leaning on his shovel, every muscle in his body humming with a deep, resonant ache. "It's finished. That whole mess is going to melt come spring," Silas stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "You'll have a swamp right up against your logs, rot the whole foundation out. You'll have to tear the whole thing down." "What were you thinking, boy?" "I was thinking about January," Elias said. Silas just shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man witnessing a tragedy he was powerless to prevent. "God help you, son. You're going to need it." The first few weeks of December were cold, but not unusually so. The temperature hovered in the low teens, dipping into the single digits at night. Inside his cabin, Elias noticed the difference immediately. He kept a small, steady fire in the stove, using only a quarter of the wood he would have normally burned. The air in the room, which in previous winters always held a damp chill away from the immediate vicinity of the stove, was now stable. It was not hot, but it was a consistent, livable cool. A thermometer his father had hung by the door, which used to drop to near freezing overnight, now never went below 50 degrees. He sat by the window one evening, Boro sleeping at his feet, the quiet ticking of the stove a comforting rhythm. Outside the wind was picking up, a low moan through the pines. He placed his hand against the log wall on the north side of the cabin. In years past, it would have been cold enough to sting, a surface radiating the full force of the winter outside. Now it was merely cool to the touch. It felt solid, neutral. The cold was not getting in. He thought of Anya's visit, of the simple, unjudging curiosity in her eyes. It was a small thing, a brief moment, but it had felt like a flicker of warmth in his solitary world. Once, on a trip to the settlement for flour and salt, he saw her outside the general store. She met his gaze and gave him a small nod and a smile before her father called her inside. It was enough. As December deepened, the old-timers started to talk. They watched the sky, noted the behavior of the birds, the unnatural stillness in the air. Silas, despite his scorn for Elias's project, was a master of weather lore. "Something's coming," he told a group of men at the store, Elias among them. "I feel it in my bones. The squirrels have been hoarding pine cones since August like it's the end of the world. This won't be a normal winter. This will be a test." The other men murmured agreement. They talked of the winter of '88, when the snow fell for 6 days straight and families had to tunnel out of their own homes. They talked of cattle freezing in their barns. They looked at Elias, standing quietly in the corner, and a few of them smirked. Mr. Gable clapped a man on the shoulder. "Well, at least we know who'll be the first to freeze solid. Young Elias and his snow house." Elias bought his supplies and left without a word. Their laughter followed him out the door. The storm arrived on the winter solstice. It began not with snow, but with a wind that was like nothing Elias had ever experienced. It came from the northwest, a physical presence that screamed down the valley. It tore at the trees, a sound like the world was being ripped apart. The sky turned a dark, bruised gray. Then the temperature began to fall. It fell with an alarming, unnatural speed. By noon, it was 10 below zero. By dusk, it was 25 below. And it was still dropping. The snow began then, not in flakes, but as a fine, granular powder, driven almost horizontally by the wind. It was less like snowfall and more like a sandstorm, scouring the landscape. Inside his cabin, Elias stoked the fire. He had a good stock of wood inside, enough for days. He listened to the storm rage outside. The wind was a solid wall of sound, a deafening, continuous roar. It was a terrifying noise, the sound of nature's full, indifferent fury. Yet, inside the cabin there was a profound stillness. The log walls did not shudder. No drafts snaked across the floor. The only sound from outside was the high-pitched shriek of the wind as it passed over the chimney. He checked the thermometer. It was 65 degrees. He sat in his chair, Boro's head on his lap, and listened. The stove ticked. The fire crackled. The wind howled its fury, but it felt distant, as if it were happening in another world. He placed his hand on the north wall again. It felt no different than it had a week ago. Cool, solid, impassive. The shield was holding. His father's theory, his scribbled notes and strange calculations were holding against the worst the world could throw at it. A slow, deep feeling of vindication settled in his chest, quiet and warm as the fire itself. He cooked his dinner, fed Boro, and banked the fire for the night. The temperature inside remained steady. He went to bed under 2 thick wool blankets, not because he was cold, but out of habit. He slept soundly, the storm's roar a lullaby. He was awoken near dawn by a different sound, a frantic, desperate pounding on his door. Burrow was on his feet in an instant, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. "Elias! Elias, for the love of God, open the door!" The voice was thin and reedy, almost carried away by the wind, but he recognized it. It was Silas. Elias unbarred the door. A blast of impossibly cold air and stinging snow flooded the room. Silas Croft stumbled inside, half falling into the room. He was covered in snow, his beard and eyebrows thick with ice. His face was a mask of gray, shocked flesh. "The fire!" he gasped, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "My fire went out. The wood, it's just not burning right. The cold, it's inside the house. The walls are covered in frost, on the inside." He looked around the cabin, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at the stove, which was glowing with a gentle, contained heat. He looked at Elias, who was standing in his shirt sleeves. It's warm in here," Silas stammered. He reached out and touched the wall next to him. His expression was one of utter incomprehension. "How?" "The walls," Elias said simply. Before Silas could respond, there was another series of desperate blows on the door. Elias opened it again. It was two more men from the settlement, the Johnson brothers. Their faces were pale with cold and fear. "Our cabin, the chinking failed," one of them said, his words clumsy with cold. "The wind is coming right through the logs. We can't keep the fire lit. It's colder inside than out." Elias stepped back and let them in. They huddled near the stove, soaking in the warmth like starving men. Within the hour, more came. A family with two small children, the parents' faces etched with terror. The children were wrapped in every blanket they owned, their lips blue. Elias's small cabin began to fill. He put a kettle on the stove for tea, his movements calm and efficient. The last to arrive was Mr. Gable. He didn't knock. The door blew open, and he half carried his wife Anya inside. Gable, the man of bluster and authority, was broken. His face was a ruin of fear and failure. Anya was pale but calm, her eyes finding Elias's across the crowded room. "The stovepipe," Gable croaked, his voice raw. "The wind tore it right off the roof. The house filled with smoke. Then the cold. God, the cold." He looked around the room, at the faces of his neighbors, all of them refugees in the house of the boy he had mocked. He looked at the simple, steady stove, at the calm in the room. His gaze finally settled on Elias. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, humbling shame. "You were right," Gable whispered, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. "You were right." Elias simply nodded and handed him a mug of hot tea. He made room for Anya and her mother near the fire. Anya looked at him, and her eyes held no surprise, only a deep, quiet confirmation. It was the look he had seen when she'd first touched the frozen wall. She had not understood, but she had believed in the conviction of his labor. The cabin, built for one man and his dog, now held 17 people. It was crowded and stuffy, but it was safe. It was a pocket of life in a world of killing cold. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind hitting a fever pitch. The thermometer Elias had outside his window had frozen and burst, but the one at the settlement, before it too froze, had registered 42 degrees below zero. It was a cold that no one had ever seen, a cold that killed. It was a cold that would have taken them all. But inside the snow-walled cabin, the temperature held at a steady 65 degrees. The children slept, safe and warm. The adults sat in stunned silence, listening to the storm that should have been their tomb, their faces illuminated by the gentle light of the stove. They were witnesses to a miracle born not of magic, but of sawdust, snow, and one man's stubborn faith in an old idea. Elias moved through the small space, adding a log to the fire, checking on the children. He was no longer the valley's fool. He was its anchor. The storm lasted for 3 days. 3 days where the world outside ceased to exist, replaced by a roaring white chaos. Inside Elias's cabin, a community was forged in the shared space of survival. They shared stories, shared their meager food, and shared a profound, unspoken gratitude. Elias said little, but his presence was a constant, calming force. He tended the fire, rationed the water, and moved with a quiet competence that belied his years. When the wind finally died and the snow stopped, the silence that fell was as profound as the storm's fury had been. A pale, watery sun emerged, illuminating a landscape transformed. The valley was buried under a dozen feet of snow. The world was smooth, white, and featureless. The only signs of human life were the plumes of smoke that now, one by one, began to rise from the few chimneys that were still visible. The people left Elias's cabin slowly, as if reluctant to leave the sanctuary. They stepped out into a world that felt alien. Their own homes were tombs of ice. Walls were coated in thick layers of rime, furniture was frozen solid, and the very air was a painful, crystalline cold. Silas Croft was the last to leave, besides the Gables. He stood at the door, his hat in his hands. He looked at Elias, and his eyes, for the first time, held no skepticism, only a deep, humbling respect. "I'm sorry, Elias," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I mocked you. We all did. We were fools, clinging to the old ways, too blind to see something new." He gestured to the wall of the cabin, the strange, snow-covered shield. "That thing you built. It's not foolishness, it's wisdom. The kind we'd forgotten." He paused, then added, "Your father would be proud." Elias felt a tightness in his throat. He just nodded. That spring, when the great melt began, the valley did not turn on Elias. There was no talk of rot or ruined foundations. Instead, the men came to him. First Silas, then the Johnson brothers, then others. They came not with scorn, but with questions. They brought notebooks and pencils. "Show us," Silas said, his request simple and direct. "Show us how you did it." And so Elias taught them. He didn't use his father's journals directly. He used his hands. He showed them how to build the forms, the precise 12-inch gap. He showed them the right consistency for the slurry of snow, water, and sawdust. He explained why the packing had to be dense, why the layers had to freeze solid. He spoke in his usual short, declarative sentences, but now they listened to every word as if it were scripture. They learned that the outer layer of loose snow was just as important, a buffer against the wind. Anya often came with her father. While the men learned the practicalities, she would bring Elias a hot drink or a piece of bread. They spoke little, but a quiet understanding grew between them. She saw the change in the valley, how the men who had once mocked him now revered him. They called his invention the Elias Wall, or, more simply, the Shield. That summer, the valley was a hive of activity. Every cabin owner, from Silas to Mr. Gable, spent the warm months preparing. They built their own forms. They stockpiled sawdust. When the first snows of the next winter fell, the valley did not greet it with curses. They greeted it as a resource. All up and down the valley, men began the arduous process of packing their own shields. Elias moved from homestead to homestead, advising, inspecting, and helping. He was no longer the isolate. He was the heart of the community's survival. The following winter was harsh, though not as brutal as the one before, but this time the valley was ready. Behind their Elias walls, families stayed warm with small, efficient fires. They visited each other, their homes comfortable and secure. The fear that had always been a silent resident of the valley in winter was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. Elias married Anya 2 summers later. Mr. Gable, a man humbled and transformed, gave the union his fervent blessing. They built an addition to the cabin, and when they did, they built the walls thick, with a permanent cavity that they filled each winter. Their home remained the warmest, the safest place in the valley. Years passed. The rhythm of the seasons turned, each winter reinforcing the wisdom of that first desperate act of construction. The Elias Wall became the standard, the way of life. Children grew up thinking it was the only way to build a house. The story of the Great Storm of 2004 became a legend told to wide-eyed children. A story of a time before the Shields, when winter was a monster at the door. And at the center of that legend was the quiet man who had listened to his father's dreams. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned gray, and his movements became slow and stiff. He spent most of his days sleeping by the stove, his amber eyes still following Elias's every move. One spring morning, when the snows were melting and the first crocuses were pushing through the soil, he did not wake up. Elias found him lying peacefully in his favorite spot. He carried the dog's still form to a small rise overlooking the cabin, a place where Boro had loved to sit and watch the sunset. He buried him there, under a tall pine, and carved a simple stone. It just said, Boro, a good and faithful friend. He stood there for a long time, one hand on the cold stone, the silence of loss, a familiar ache. Elias and Anya raised 3 children in the snow-walled cabin. They grew up strong and kind, with their father's quiet patience and their mother's perceptive warmth. Elias taught his sons how to build the walls, just as he had taught the other men of the valley. He taught them to respect the old knowledge, but to never be afraid to listen to a new idea, no matter how strange it seemed. He grew old himself. His dark hair turned to silver, and his broad shoulders stooped slightly from a lifetime of labor. But his eyes remained clear and focused. He became the valley's elder, a man of few words but immense authority. When newcomers arrived, they were told to go see Elias, to learn how to survive the winters. He lived to see his grandchildren building their own homes, their own shields. He saw his father's theory, once a mad scribble in a journal, become the bedrock of a thriving community. The valley was no longer just a place of survival. It was a place of prosperity, its people secure against the harshest element. On a cold winter's night, in his 86th year, Elias passed away in his sleep, in the warm, quiet cabin he had made a fortress. Anya was beside him. The fire in the stove ticked softly, the same sound that had been the backdrop of his entire life. Outside, a gentle snow was falling, adding another layer to the thick, protective walls of the house. They buried him on the rise, next to Boro, overlooking the valley he had saved. The entire community came, their faces etched with a grief that was deep and personal. Silas Croft's son, now an old man himself, spoke. "He taught us that strength isn't about fighting the storm," he said, his voice raspy. "It's about understanding it. He taught us to build with the cold, not against it." They erected a monument, not for him, but for his idea. They preserved his original cabin, a historical landmark for future generations. Beside the door, under the deep eave, they placed a simple bronze plaque. It read, "The Elias Croft Cabin, 1886. He listened to the snow, and it taught him how to be warm. His quiet persistence became our strength. His legacy is our survival. Decades later, long after everyone who had known him was gone, the cabin still stood. Each winter, the Historical Society would pack the forms with snow, water, and pulp, just as he had done. It was a ritual, an act of remembrance. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howled down from the northwest and the temperature plummeted, a single small fire in the old iron stove was enough to keep the interior at a gentle, steady 65 degrees. The walls, born of a young man's grief and an old man's dream, held fast. They always would.